Chapter 5. A Surprise for Beth. Laurie and the four girls were soon great friends. Mr. Brooke complained to the old gentleman that his student was always running across to see the marches. "Let him have a bit of a holiday," said Mr. Lawrence. "He can catch up with his studies later." What good times they had, writing and acting plays, happy evenings at the marches, and little parties at the big house. Only Beth was too shy to go there. When Mr. Lawrence heard about Beth's shyness, he came to have tea with their mother one day and began to talk about music and great singers he had heard. Beth found it impossible to stay in her corner and came to listen. "Laurie hasn't much time for his music," Mr. Lawrence told Mrs. March, "so the piano is not used very often. Would any of your girls like to play it sometimes? They needn't see or speak to anyone, and I'll be in my study." He got up to go, but if they don't want to come. At this moment, a little hand touched his own. It was Beth's. I want to come," she said, her voice shaking. "Very much." "You're the musical girl," said Mr. Lawrence gently. "I'm Beth. Yes, I love music, and I shall come." The next day, Beth waited until the old and the young gentleman both went out. Then she ran across to the big house and found her way to the room with the beautiful piano. As soon as she began to play, she forgot her fears immediately in the delight which the music gave her. After that, Beth went every day. She never knew that Mr. Lawrence often opened his study door to hear her playing, or that Laurie stood in the hall to keep the servants away from the shy little girl. But she was so grateful that she asked her mother and sisters to help her make the old gentleman a pair of slippers. After several days' careful sewing, the slippers were finished. Then Beth wrote a short letter and, with Laurie's help, left it with the slippers in the old man's study one morning before he was up. The next day, Beth went out for a walk, and when she came back, the others were waiting for her. "Here's a letter for you, Beth," they called out. "Come and read it." She hurried to the house and they took her into the front room. "Look there," everyone was saying at once. Beth looked and got the biggest surprise of her life, for there stood a lovely little piano with a letter on the top of it addressed to Miss Elizabeth March. You read it, Joe," whispered Beth. "I can't." So Joe opened the letter and began to read. "Dear Miss March," she read, "I have had many pairs of slippers, but none which have pleased me so much as yours. I should like to thank you for your kindness by sending you something that once belonged to my little granddaughter, who died. With many thanks, I am your good friend, James Lawrence." Joe put an arm around her sister. "Now try it, Beth," she said. Beth sat down and began to play, and everyone thought it was the most perfect piano they had ever heard. "You'll have to go and thank him," said Joe, with a smile, knowing that Beth was much too shy to do anything like that. But Beth surprised them all. "I'll do it at once," she said bravely, and away she walked through the garden into the big house next door. She went up to the old gentleman's study and knocked on the door. "Come in," said Mr. Lawrence. Beth went in. "I came to say thank you, sir," she began in her quiet little voice. But he looked so friendly that she ran and put both her arms around his neck and kissed him. The old gentleman was so surprised that he nearly fell off his chair, but he was very pleased indeed by that shy little kiss, and soon the two of them were talking like old friends. Later, he walked home with Beth. The girls, watching with great interest from the window, could not believe their eyes. "Well," Meg said, "I do believe the world is coming to an end." Chapter 6. Amy in Trouble. "Where are you going?" Amy asked Meg and Joe one afternoon. "I want to come too." "You can't, dear. You're not invited," said Meg. "You're going somewhere with Laurie. I know you are." "Yes, we are," said Joe. "Now stop annoying us." "You're going to the theater," Amy said suddenly. "I want to go with you." "We could take her, I suppose," began Meg. "No, Laurie only invited us," said Joe. "I shall go," shouted Amy. "Meg says I can." "You just stay where you are," said Joe angrily. "I'll make you sorry for this, Joe March," Amy shouted as Meg and Joe left the house. The two older sisters enjoyed themselves at the theater, but Jo couldn't stop worrying as she wondered what Amy would do to make her sorry. She found out the next afternoon. Beth, Amy, and Meg were sitting together when Jo ran into the room. "Has anyone taken my notebook?" Jo asked. Meg and Beth said no at once, but Amy said nothing. "Amy, you've got it," said Jo. "No, I haven't," said Amy. "That's a lie," said Jo. "Tell me the truth or I'll make you." "Do what you like," said Amy. "You'll never see your stupid book again because I burned it." Jo's face went white. "What? But I worked so hard writing my stories." "I said I'd make you sorry, and I have," said Amy. Jo jumped at Amy and shook her shoulders. "You wicked, wicked girl," cried Jo. "I'll never, ever forgive you." And she ran out of the room. Mrs. March came home and heard the story. "Oh, how could you do that, Amy?" she said. "That was Jo's book of stories. She wrote them all herself and was hoping to make them good enough to print." Slowly, Amy began to understand the terrible thing she had done and started to cry. Later, when Jo appeared for tea, Amy begged her sister to forgive her. "I shall never forgive you," Jo answered. It was not a happy evening, and when singing time came, Jo remained silent. Afterwards, she kissed her mother and said good night. "My dear, don't go to bed feeling so angry with your sister," whispered Mrs. March. "I'm sorry, Mother. I can't forgive her," replied Jo. Next day, Jo wanted to get out of the house, so she picked up her skates and went next door to ask Laurie to take her skating. Amy heard them going. "Jo promised to take me with her next time," she complained. "It's hard for her to forgive you, Amy," said Meg. "Go after them and wait until Jo is enjoying herself, then give her a kiss or do something kind." It was not far to the river, but Jo and Laurie were already skating when Amy arrived. Jo saw Amy but turned away. Laurie was carefully skating along the edge of the ice and didn't see the younger girl. Amy put her skates on and stood on the ice. "Keep near the edge. The ice isn't safe in the middle," Laurie called to Jo. Then he disappeared round the first bend in the river. Jo heard, but Amy did not. Jo realized that Amy probably hadn't heard, but she said nothing and skated after Laurie. Let Amy look after herself, Jo thought. Amy skated out towards the smoother ice in the middle of the river. Jo reached the bend, and for a moment she stood still, a strange feeling in her heart. Something made her turn around. Just in time to see Amy throw up her hands and go crashing through the ice into the cold water. Amy gave a cry that made Jo's heart stop with fear. She tried to call Laurie, but her voice was gone, and for a second she could only stand and stare at the little blue hood of Amy's coat above the black water. Suddenly, Laurie skated past her and shouted, "Bring a piece of wood from the side of the river, quickly." Wild with fear, Jo fetched some wood and pulled it across the ice, while Laurie held Amy's head above the water. Together, they got her out. She was more frightened than hurt, and was quickly taken home. They covered her in blankets and tried to calm her, and after a little while, she fell asleep in front of the warm fire. Later, when everything was quiet, Jo asked her mother, "Are you sure she's safe?" "Quite safe, dear. It was sensible to get her home as quickly as you did. Laurie did it all," said Jo. "Mother, if she should die, it will be my fault. I get angry so quickly. Why can't I be more like you?" "I get angry nearly every day of my life, Jo," said Mrs. March, "but I've learned not to show it. I've learned to stop myself saying the angry words that come to my lips, and you must try to do the same, my dear." Amy moved in her sleep and Jo looked at her. "I refused to forgive her, and today she nearly died, and it was Laurie who saved her. How could I be so wicked?" Jo began to cry. Then Amy opened her eyes and held out her arms with a smile that went straight to Jo's heart. Neither of them said a word, but they held each other close, and everything was forgiven and forgotten.